Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. And yes, you're right. I found my passion late in life. I didn't go to university till I was in my 40s. And now I found a way to marry my two passions, really filmmaking and trying to make a difference in people's lives around brain health. There's a lot of similarities across brain health and loneliness. Most people associate brain health with later life and preventing dementia, but everybody with the brain needs to consider brain health, just as every single one of us needs to consider loneliness, both in terms of ourselves and our own health, and also in terms of those around us. I think it's absolutely amazing sitting here. I'm from Ireland. Listening to what your government has already done is absolutely fantastic. Wonderful to have the Minister for Social Security. We have slightly different names here. I think the thing is, loneliness is such a cross-cutting issue that you need to get every minister involved. You need Minister for Health, Minister for Environment, the whole thing. But also we can't just leave it to government. It's a societal issue and we have to play our part in it too. We can't just abdicate responsibility, and we can do that in very, very simple ways, I believe. One piece of advice that I give around brain health is I have a little app that you can download for free, and it gives top tips every day for brain health. But one of my favorites is to smile. Smile 5 times a day. That's what I would prescribe. Smile when you get up in the morning. Smile before you go to bed. And share at least one smile with somebody else, because then you're spreading the health benefits of that smile. And you can do the other smiles whenever, the other 2 that are left, whenever you want. Anyway, yes, I feel like a bit of a fraud because usually I talk about brain health, it's my expertise, but social isolation and loneliness increase your risk for developing dementia in later life. So that's where I come in on this, and it's one of my top tips for brain health is to stay socially engaged. So that's where I'm speaking from. So I'm going to bookend what I'm talking with 2 quotes. The Minister mentioned about connecting with the people who have the lived experience. So the 2 quotes that I'm going to bookend my talk with come from a survey that was conducted by Respond, who provide biggest provider of social housing in Ireland. So this resident said, feeling lonely is like being thrown in at the deep end with no one to save you. I think it's an amazing quote. It really, really just gets there. And when I move on a bit to actually talk about something later, you'll see how absolutely astute this is. So basically, I'm reiterating really, and I don't want to double up, but it's very important. So as everyone says, you know, most of the research in the area and most of the talk in the area is about talking about older adults, but loneliness affects us right across the lifespan. I mean, I can go through the list. Students, new months, my own personal experience. I think we can all talk. Before I do that, actually, I'm a researcher by nature, and just what I'd love to do is a show of hands, if you don't mind. So I'd like you to put up your hands if you have never experienced loneliness in your life. Just have a look around the room. There isn't one hand up. It's a complete human experience. It is part of who we are. Think of a moment when you experience loneliness. None of us are at later life at this point, I hope, unless we get knocked down and go to cross the road. But basically, I mean, for me, the one that comes to mind for me is when I had my first child. It was long before really, you know, internet and iPhones, and I never felt so alone in my life and so scared. I just didn't know what to do. And I think that's at the crux of why loneliness is an issue in our modern society. I had a lovely 4-bedroomed house and 1 child. I had nobody around me. My child cried all day. I had nobody around me to talk to teach me how to be a mother. Giving birth doesn't come with a manual. Well, we think that we have progressed wonderfully. We think we're this amazing society. We measure success by how big a box we can live in, how big a box we can isolate ourselves from the rest of society. And we're social beings. We need social contact. And in some ways, I think that's where we really, really went wrong. And we've moved away from what is a fundamental human need. We've made it harder for ourselves. So clearly the fact that nobody put their hands up when I said, think of, you know, if you've never experienced loneliness. So we've all experienced it. But it's kind of one of those things that's very hard to articulate. You know when you're feeling it, but what is it? What is loneliness? What are we actually talking about here at this conference? So we know, as everybody said, that loneliness is a risk factor for poor psychological and physical health. So it's really described as aversive feelings, so that means unpleasant feelings that you really would like to get rid of separateness, alienation, distress, isolation. And of course, as was said earlier, it can be felt when you're among family or among friends or even in a crowd. And it's aroused by the failure to satisfy the need for intimacy, a social need. And it has been conceptualized, and this is a bit jargony, as a discrepancy between the desired and achieved levels of social relations. So I think it kind of is easier if we talk about it as a mismatch. So it's a mismatch between what we need and what we actually have in terms of the quantity and quality of our social relations. And it's very, very individual, and it's very subjective. And it really can be context dependent, and it can change in situations. You don't necessarily be lonely in all aspects of your life. Do you know, you can experience loneliness in your workplace or loneliness in your college, but not in your family. And actually, people spoke about, for example, certain communities, and we were actually just talking about this at dinner last night, you know, worrying about communities that are socially excluded. It's very important not to confuse social isolation with social exclusion, because we do as a society exclude some people. We exclude older adults, we're marginalising them, we're warehousing them away so we don't have to see that nasty thing called dementia, where I call them the leper colonies of the present time. We exclude certain groups, but those people that are excluded can still actually have a sense of community and can within their own community feel very included and may not actually experience isolation. So it's very complex but very human. That's the real point. So why do we feel lonely? Pretty much every single behavior that we have has survived because it serves a purpose. It is adaptive. We have evolved, and we retain behaviors because they serve a purpose. And loneliness is no different. Same as stress is no different. Everybody thinks of stress as a completely negative thing and as loneliness as a completely negative thing. But they've survived because they serve a purpose. But for example, in stress, it's in a chronic acute situation. It's in an acute situation to deal with something, and it's not meant to be chronic. Similarly with loneliness, it's okay in a small amount because it serves a purpose that I'll talk about in a moment. But it's when it becomes chronic that it is a problem. And I think if people understand what loneliness is, that then maybe we could start opening up the conversation. Because the problem at the moment is loneliness is stigmatized. We have this misconception, which is absolutely wrong, that loneliness says something about your social skills maybe, or your likability or your lovability or whatever. It really hasn't got anything to do with that. So basically, to explain where loneliness comes from, this is a theory behind where loneliness comes from. So excuse me, a variety of biological mechanisms have evolved that capitalize on aversive signals to motivate behavior that is essential for our survival or for reproduction. So an aversive signal, as I mentioned earlier, is an unpleasant feeling that we will do anything to try and avoid. We will act upon it. So hunger is one of those signals. So it's triggered by low blood sugar in our body, and it motivates us to eat. And in the past, we had to have that because you had to go out and you had to hunt for your food, or you had to gather for it. Now we have to take a trip to the fridge, so there's a little bit of a problem around that, but that's a whole other talk. But thirst is the same. So the argument here really is, and this theory is that loneliness is an aversive trigger to motivate you towards a behavior. And it's valuable in small doses, but in the long term it's chronic and it's dangerous. So that's it, that loneliness really is an aversive signal. So like a biological warning, like an alarm bell, that you are a social being. We're a social species, and we need those social relationships in order to survive, to prosper, and to reproduce. So basically, as human beings, we form bonds which provide mutual aid. And that's the important thing. And that's really important when you come to talk about interventions, right? Because we do an awful lot of fixing, and we go in, and it's almost an imbalance in a relationship because we kind of go in to fix the person. But the bond that prevents social isolation it must be reciprocal. It's a mutual need. So we bond together as a human group to help each other out, because humans don't really survive very well alone. If we're actually ostracized from society, we tend to perish and we become ill. Excuse me. Now, in sort of the human condition, if you think of society as a group, sometimes humans exclude an individual from society in a way to enforce social norms. And then what can happen is, if an individual tries to get back into the group, the enforcement will become stronger, and the violence could be issued upon the person or whatever. So then what happens is, what kicks in order to increase self-preservation, the individual who has been excluded becomes more alert. We know in their brain their visual cortex becomes heightened. So they become more alert, and they're on a constant state of alert. They're excluded, they're alone, they're unsafe, their sleep becomes disturbed because they don't have the other members of the group to protect them. And a really interesting thing happens. The area of their brain responsible for empathy, there's reduced activity in empathy, which is really interesting. So the more lonely we become, the less empathetic we become. And that's what's absolutely interesting. If you recall earlier, I said, we have this thing that, those who become socially isolated maybe are socially awkward. They don't have so good social skills. Actually, that's not true. There's no data to show that there's a difference across that. But what research does show is that when we become lonely, we become less socially skilled. So it actually impacts on our ability to engage appropriately in a social situation. And I think that's really, again, very important if you're talking about interventions. I mentioned earlier really about the issue being around modern society. We've structured it. Why is there an increase in loneliness? And it's really in Western society. We've changed how we've structured things. And we've moved away from the group that has a bond. And now we also really don't have that generational bond. Villages and families and groups live together for a very long time. And then there's the other thing. You can't really talk about this without talking about social networking and how much time we spend online. And the interesting thing is, if you use social networks such as Facebook, Twitter, whatever, if you use it to promote face-to-face contact, then it decreases loneliness. So if you actually use it to connect with people, actually Tinder and stuff like that maybe. But if you use it to replace face-to-face contact, it actually increases loneliness. And in fact, if I was to talk about stress, it increases stress as well. So it can be a useful tool. I remember, I'm kind of getting on in years, but I remember being lonely as a teenager, because you had to wait maybe for someone to call you on the house phone, or you had no way to find people. And I remember our social hub as teenagers was our local tennis club. I don't know how many times I walked down to that tennis club hoping some of the people that I knew would be there so that I could spend some time with them. So now actually we do have this fabulous tool so that our teens can connect with each other. But the important thing is to make sure that it's used to then go from online to offline to actually connect. So, consequence, how am I doing for time? Did you wave yet? I have a man at the back waving at me because I really could talk forever. So yes, we know that it's a major risk factor. It increases unease. I mentioned that earlier, because you're on this heightened alert. Your brain is waiting and watching, so you feel unease, and you know that feeling in your stomach? It's kind of anxiety, and you become dissatisfied with life. It increases anxiety and social withdrawal. So you get this kind of sort of loop, this circle thing, because if you go back to what I was saying about, you know, inherent in our evolutionary behavior, if you go back, try to get back into a group, you may actually have, you know, further discipline enforced on you. So actually there's this thing to hang back then again, you know, for fear of what might happen. It actually really impairs sleep quality, and that just has so many knock-on effects on so many other health issues. And again, the reasoning behind that seems to be, you don't go into proper deep sleep, and it's a fragmented sleep, because it's this constant thing. You've nobody guarding for you, you've no mutual aid, and so your body keeps you on this heightened state. It increases your blood pressure, which in turn increases your risk for heart disease, and in turn increases your risk for developing dementia. Increases your risk of cognitive decline, dementia itself, and susceptibility to viruses. And unfortunately, it's predictive of suicide in later life, and higher use of medications, and higher use of A&E. And I think people know much more about this, but you know, arguably, people, you know, some people go to the doctor to talk to somebody. So then the key thing really is to remember that loneliness has nothing to do with being alone. I talk the hind legs off a donkey when I'm out. I'm very social when I'm out, but boy, do I love being alone. I really get this quote: I just love solitude. I love the silence, you know, and it's a very pleasant thing. So it's got nothing to do with loneliness. They're very, very different things. Now, I want to talk to you about this, because I think this really gets across. We've talked about all the things that loneliness is a risk for in terms of health, and I believe loneliness is a health issue. I've spoken to our own minister for within our Department of Health, Minister for Older Persons and Mental Health, pleading that it be put on the health agenda as a health issue. If it's got the same risk as smoking and obesity, well, we need the same sort of money and the same sort of campaigns put to it. It just needs to get there in on the agenda. But this is from 2015, and it's a meta-analysis review. And basically, this is an incredible meta-analysis, because they brought together 70 studies with over 3 million, almost 3.5 million participants. And it was a prospective study. So it was a longitudinal study, and the average length of time between the measurements taken at time 1 and the measurements taken at time 2 was 8 years. And actually, the research question was this. It's pretty kind of crude. Who remained alive and who was dead at follow-up? And they were looking at 3 measures around this issue. And they are distinct things, and that's very important again when you're going forward, because you know what intervention you develop for loneliness won't work for social isolation or living alone. So there are 3 distinct things. So social isolation in the context of this was defined as a pervasive lack of social contact or communication, or participation in social activities, or having a confidant. And that's measured objectively by a scale. Living alone versus living with others. And then loneliness, that feeling of isolation, disconnectedness, and not belonging. The results. Loneliness increased your likelihood of death, and that's over 8 years. 26% for those, if you reported loneliness, you were 26% more likely to be dead after 8 years. If you were socially isolated, you were 29% more likely to be dead. And if you were living alone, you were 32% more likely to be dead. If that's not a figure to wave across government, I don't know what is. Loneliness, social isolation, and living alone are killing people, and they're killing quite a proportion of our populations, irrespective of age. So this isn't older people. So ageism can't be thrown into it. Now they're old and they're going to die anyway. This is irrespective of age. It's also irrespective of socioeconomic status and length of follow-up. So the average length of follow-up was 8 years. That's the argument. Loneliness is a public health issue. Evidence is increasing and building, and particularly as we've talked, most of the evidence is in and around older adults, and population aging is, as we all, I presume most people here know, population aging is one of the biggest challenges that's going to face us. And the risks associated with social isolation and loneliness are comparable with well-established risk factors for mortality, so for death. So physical inactivity, obesity, substance abuse, sexual behaviours, unhealthy sexual behaviours, mental health, injury, violence, environmental quality, immunisation and access to healthcare. It has to go in to the health sector. What can we do? Well, you're going to talk about that in terms of this afternoon. A couple of pointers in terms of interventions. Both social isolation and loneliness, simply increasing contact may not mitigate loneliness. Because loneliness, if you think of it as this adaptive response, so if you consider interventions that consider to alter the signal, which is loneliness, that feeling lonely, so that's the signal hunger, without regard to the behaviour, so the eating or the social connection, then it will be ineffective. The other thing to think about is where I mentioned that loneliness reduces the activity in the area of our brain associated with empathy. So loneliness can decrease our social skills, coming back to that need to self-preserve. So I think what would be really helpful is to start educating people about what loneliness actually does organically in our brain. And I think if we do that, that can help tackle the stigma around it and help normalize it and let people understand as they accept other health issues or something that's going on in their body. And I think it's really important to address stigma, have conversations and add to the health agenda. One area for me in terms of older adults, I've spoken about this, is volunteering. Unlike loneliness, volunteering has huge health benefits. It's really, really good for you. And as I was talking about that mutual thing, and I spoke before about befriending, it's very important that there's equity in the relationship. And we have a befriending organisation in Ireland, and one of the things they do is go in and suggest activities that people could do to tackle their social isolation. What I suggest is that they go in and they actually suggest that those individuals become volunteers. And so they then are empowered and they're taking part. And the thing about that is that ultimately will slowly impact on those issues around empathy, because going out and volunteering in an empowering situation can help start to stimulate that again. So I think that's a really important way to do it. For older adults, they're currently undervalued, underused, they're excluded. They are actually really an untapped resource, and loneliness is having a negative impact on their health. And volunteer organisations are under-resourced, underfunded, and there's such positive health impacts. And it starts with inclusive. And I stretch that then to organisations working with people with disabilities, to organisations working, across the sectors. Include the people that your organisation works with as volunteers in the organisation, and it goes more towards connectivity. I can probably just flick through the rest of these. Am I okay? Have I? Okay. Yeah, this is the thing. I think I kind of touched on it really. Why do we have segregation in society? Why, in terms of care, for example? Why do we have care homes for older adults? Why do we have care homes for people with dementia? Why do we have care homes for people with disability? I laugh when people talk about the general population and then they consign older adults or people with disabilities to the appendices of policy documents. Oh, and them too. Sorry, they're the general population. We are the general population. We are all the general population. So actually, if we're providing care, it should be for everybody together, not bunching the dementia people here who, being with a bunch of people with dementia, aren't going to progress. Actually, if you put childcare in with dementia care, in with other types of disability care, as a society we learn to integrate from the word go. We learn to integrate from a creche. We learn to stop being afraid of people with mental health issues, with intellectual disabilities, with dementia. The problem is, because you segregate from the start, people don't know how to integrate, and it stems from fear. And I think that doing that would be something that would really, really address social isolation. I mean, it's literally just the opposite. You're starting from a society that thinks about inclusion first. I've said that really. I probably don't have time to play that.
Well, you probably could do that, and then that would be, if you want to.
Yeah, that's it then, really. Yeah. I'll go to my last.
Yes. A good carer puts the person they care for first.
Whoops.
Puts their own needs on hold.
Yeah.
Right? Wrong. On an airplane, there's a reason why we're told to put on our oxygen masks first, before helping others. It makes sense, because then you can help others. As a carer, it is important to look after yourself by eating a balanced diet, exercising, and by getting a good night's sleep. Looking after yourself as a carer is not selfish, it's sensible. When your needs as a carer are taken care of, then the person in your care will benefit too. Looking after your emotional and...
I should just put a tiny bit of context on that. We did a study called Distress, where we were looking at 300 spousal dementia carers, to looking at their own brain health, their own risk for developing dementia, because the study had shown they were at increased risk. And we had time 1 and time 2. In time 1, what came out as what was most stressful for them were 2 things: dealing with challenging behaviours in their loved one, and the second one was loss of social intimacy. So I got some funding to disseminate those findings, and rather than write a paper and go to conferences, I used the money to develop a couple of these little films and a little piece on a website. So basically the aim of this film is to actually tell those explain how they can address that loss of social intimacy. And it gets the message across to people, and we said, an appropriate hug. We had to kind of be very careful how we said that, but you cannot underestimate the value of human contact. A hug actually lowers blood pressure. It's incredible what it can do. There's our top tips for brain health. That's on hellobrain.eu. All that I do is available free. One thing I did want to say was just on staying socially engaged. People with more, there's a direct correlation, so this is my brain health stuff now. There's a direct correlation between the density of your social networks and the density of your neural networks in your brain. So people with more social ties live longer, have better health, are less depressed, and are less likely to develop cognitive impairment. Research shows that social interaction, just 10 minutes of social interaction, can increase your brain performance, and it may deliver better benefits than solving crossword puzzles, and it's more fun. So it really is rewarding, and it will reduce your dementia risk. And this is my final quote from a respondent. Loneliness is a killer. It was a throwaway line, but it's the truest thing of all. Thank you.